talk about elite bargain, and fair enough, and the overview that you've given us is wonderful. But I think also begs the question, what you say, you talked about that a little. We've got a lot of development books. Asimov Robinson, two of them. We've got North. We've got so many others. Phelps. So many people have written about development. How does your thinking differ from them? And how does it compare with them? Because the question is that we have a lot of this stuff and we don't know how to handle it.
I've been at the World Bank for a long time and working in development for a long time. And one of the conclusions I came to early was that if you want to work on development, you have to be an optimist. You have to believe that tomorrow can be better than today. Otherwise, you should pack up and do something else.
One of the things as a lot of these development books do is correctly, talk about what should be done. Trying to communicate the basic tenets of what should be done. And we were alluding to earlier, I was alluding to the Growth Commission report. It's actually also a very good report in saying these are the kind of things that successful countries do. And I would look at a lot of these books over the years written, you put it in a different space. If you read the Joe Stiglitz books, it's all in the international system. If you get the maybe more the Jeff Sachs or the Paul Collier's, it's all in domestic particular reforms that need to be done. And it makes a lot of sense. What I wanted to make sure is to actually understand things like, but why doesn't it happen? It's not about institutions, which, according to the literature, are shaped through historical foundations. In fact, that's what the core research papers tell us, that settler patterns originally are causing the institutions you have. If I go to Nigeria and I go and talk to President Buhari, and he asked me, how can we develop better? My best answer, based on Asimov Robinson, was, why don't you get yourself a better history? Now, if you come as a British official, it's not very useful as a piece of advice.
Europe had the advantage of innovating their elite bargains, their consensus, because elite bargain is common everywhere, I guess. Even the US has an elite bargain that they'll, screw the rest of the world. That's an elite bargain too. And Europe had the advantage that they did it themselves. We have the disadvantage of an open economy. I often thought I should write Animal Farm with an open economy. That if Animal Farm had a lot of advisors coming in from outside, how would they fare? I think what Stefan tells us, that we should learn to navigate those advisors. I agree, Stefan. But here in Islamabad, we have 100 agencies that one minister has to deal with. So I don't know whether the coordination problem is with us or with the donors. But these are deep issues that we'll take up some other time.
Professor Stefan Dercon, he is a professor of economic policy at the University of Oxford, UK. And we are delighted to have with us Matthew Varghese. He is regional director for South Asia, the World Bank Group. So with this, I would like to first invite Dr. Dure Nayab. She will give you an overview, a quick overview of the reforms. It's a very, juicy word for us. We hear all the time in Pakistan. So she will give you a quick review of what kind of reforms we had in the past. And then she will hand it over to the panel. Nayab.
Islah, Fahim has already mentioned this word. Islah is reform. Anyone knowing Urdu or Arabic, it's an Urdu word for reform. And we at PIDE think that if this is not the time for reform, I think it would be just too late for us. Just a very, very quick history for those who do not know. As a country, we've been a little confused and uncertain what path to follow. This is a very, very brief and quick outline. In the 50s, of course, Pakistan got independence in 47. It was early years. We were transitioning from traditional economy. Then it was economic expansion. Then there was a period of nationalization and command economy in the 70s when all the industry was nationalized. In 80s, in fact, in 80s, 90s, 2000s, we've been just going through phases of growth, privatization, then rethinking privatization, liberalization, rethinking liberalization, then again growth, then again stagnation, then inflation, stagflation. I mean, this is going on for decades now, but the 2020s, like we are seeing right now, it's full-blown economic crisis. This is a summary of the boom-bust cycles Pakistan has gone through. We've gone up, we've gone down, we've gone up, we've gone down. Along with our national policies, if you see, we've been through wars, through earthquakes, through floods. Those have seen us going down, but some of the wars in which the world was with us, we went up. So it's a very, this one graph says a lot about how Pakistani economy moves. Too many plans, too little development. It's not as if we are not thinking. Again, the timeline shows 5-year plans, 10-year plans, midterm plans, growth frameworks, 10-year perspective development plans, visions, and then there are the MDGs and SDGs, which we have to follow, and sadly, we achieve none. Even when we think of reform, the reform is more of the same. This is one work we did on the civil service reforms, a reform that somehow is ignored in most of our development plans. These are over 30 reform efforts that have been made. And if there ever was an elite bargain, this whole 32 reform timeline would show that ultimately it just got better for them. There was no performance indicator included, nothing that actually improved the civil service, but there were reforms. Pakistan, a perpetual patient in the IMF ICU. Dr. Nadeem says that going to IMF is an ICU. We are in our 23rd program right now and already planning to be in the 24th in February. These graphs are in two segments just because of the numbers. The index changes. So starting from 1958 to 59 till now, it's been one IMF program after another. I just did a quick archival study from newspapers, and I think even they summarize it very well. When we are going through our boom period, Pakistan predicted to be world's fastest growing Muslim economy in 2017. 2017 is like 6 years back. Nothing like that happened. Pakistan's new budget aims to please the IMF. This headline can be from the 70s, 80s, 90s, or 6 months back. And then again, we are optimistic when the boom period comes. Pakistan's economy ready for takeoff. And since I've used this word takeoff, a very sad analogy, but still a very relevant one, country story resembles that of our national airlines, Pakistan International Airlines. We started off well. PIA aircraft now takes off or lands every 6 minutes on its worldwide network. Some of you would know that our tagline in those days used to be PIA, great people to fly with. And then what happened with PIA? Bad management, debt, 260 billion debt, and the airline is chained, dead, more of a carcass now. And we say we want to sail an injured organization. It's the same story for Pakistan. We do well, but right now, PIA and Pakistan are practically in the same situation. Then our obsession with foreign aid. This cartoon is from 1950. This is our prime minister at that time, Liaquat Ali Khan. He's on crutches, which look like dollars. And from the window, since you can't read, it says, this should prevent him from learning to walk. He'll always need our help. And sadly, this is how it has been. That's why we think it's time to reform. We need to rethink, reform, and revive. And when I say revive, I'm a demographer. I would say not just the economy, the society in totality. We did a survey on social capital. Our trust levels are at the lowest. We don't trust our organizations. We don't trust our institutions. We don't even trust ourselves. How can businesses flourish in an environment where there is no trust? So this is a new initiative by PIDE. We've been working on reform for quite some time now, but now we have given it a name, ISLA, Rethink, Reform, and Revive. In the last few years, we've come up with a few documents talking about reform. They are there on your table as well. The PIDE reform agenda for accelerated and sustained growth. It talks in detail about all the sectors that we think need reform. Then our governments usually say, what should we do right now? What should we do? I mean, they are in firefighting mode. So Pakistan, 1 year growth strategy. Okay, don't think too far, just 1 year growth strategy. And since we are hopefully nearing elections, PIDE's Charter of Economy. Here we have included a lot of things that are linked to election, politics, cabinet. I won't go into detail, but here is a very, very quick summary of some of the areas we are dealing with. Governance for the 21st century, we are talking about local government, parliament, elections, cabinet, police, judiciary. Like elections, we want democracy, but is just voting democracy, or do we need to reform the whole process, how these elections are held, how cabinet is formed? Then removing sludge and deregulation. We have a lot of work on sludge, removing the barriers on bureaucracy and the autonomous agencies. Focus on economic. Pakistanis don't talk about economic policy. If you just turn on TV for one evening, you'll see all we talk about is politics. So the focus needs to be on the economic policy, like the planning commission should be independent. How the budget making process should go. Debt management, public investment, merit, operational independence. Then we are talking about developing markets, the real estate market, agriculture, electricity, gas, fuel. The 3 T's, trade, tariff, taxation, all need reform. I mean, if you just look at our tariff structure, there are hundreds and hundreds of lines. Anyone wanting to get involved would get scared. And then modernization. Countries don't develop without cities. We need to develop cities. Internet for all. Now we say that internet is a basic human right. Digital divide is going to divide the people in future. If people do not have internet, they are going to lag behind. Then reforming our education system. It's so dated. Our methods are so dated. Our curriculum is so dated. The document is there. So I'll just end by saying that we talk of inclusivity, but it always goes toward providing relief. Relief is something temporary. Relief is unsustainable. And inherently, it's hierarchical. It means somebody is providing relief and somebody is taking relief. Why not just reform the system that we do not have to provide relief all the time? We need structural and procedural reforms, reform how we govern, reform how we do business, reform how we think, reform how we make policies. And for this is our slogan these days, local research for local solution. We need to think for ourselves. Imported solutions don't work. Thank you.
Okay, folks, I think Nayab has set the stage very well. We've given Stephen a little bit of our progress with lack of reform. I'll now just hand it straight over to Stefan. He's got a lovely book, and I think he's got something to put Pakistan in context now. So Stefan, please, over to you.
I didn't write the title of my presentation like this. Okay, so this is just the typical thing of thing. Let's not worry about it. I will tell you what I will going to talk about it. I think first I want to thank for hosting me, and it's great to be able to talk to you about. To talk to you about it, and I want to talk about elite bargains here. I want to talk about economic reforms, and actually I want to probably make sure you take away 3 things. And so the first one is that change will have to come from inside, and it will have to be economics and politics coming together. You can't just do it purely technocratically. there has to be an understanding of these two together. The second point I want to say, we'll only make progress in the longer term if we begin to actually get an element of consensus around politics and economics. And we'll talk a bit about what that could look like in the short run, in the long run. And then thirdly, it is, as the previous speaker, actually, it was a beautiful and eloquent presentation of some of these challenges. This is never about importing things from outside. There's no blueprints anywhere, but there are lessons to be learned from neighboring places. And that actually is worth thinking in mind, not in terms of exactly what you do, but actually how they get to where they are now. And I want to briefly start with that. And indeed, I wrote a book on, and I will refer a little bit to it, and I'm going to race through some of the key arguments to actually try to actually provoke you and saying, things that I think what it may mean for Pakistan. Okay, I'll provoke you. I will be wrong on many things, but it's basically making sure that you will probably then can correct me and I can learn from you too. But if we look around the world, this is an amazing 3 decades that we've had in the world. Middle-income countries, of which Pakistan is a member, were growing on average in per capita terms, 3.9% per year growth over 30 years, since 1990. The winners are the ones who are well above it. And the list is there, listed again, China, India, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, Indonesia, Ghana, Ethiopia. These are not countries that will also hit crisis. There's several of them say, they're in crisis. But actually, they've had long periods. And they give me always hope that they can correct themselves. I think losers are places like Nigeria, yes, and indeed as Pakistan, where actually they're well below that mean growth rate. It's not terrible, Pakistan 2.6% per year in that period. It's not as bad as, for example, the Democratic Republic of Congo, that is now about a third poorer than it was in 1990. But actually, in a period where there was so much opportunity in the world, Pakistan didn't progress. And a lot of your neighbors, but also African countries like Ghana, I will mention them now, because if you look at Pakistan, actually, I know you would not like to be compared to Ghana, to an African country, but, middle-income country like Ghana was roughly where you are in 1990. Ghana is now, and if you were to look at this picture, is actually now more like India. India has surpassed Pakistan, where you were well ahead then, and in per capita growth terms, India is well past you. But Bangladesh, that was about half of, maybe a bit more than half of your GDP per capita in 1990, is now better off than you are. There's these things. There's a lot of countries, and even, it now looks more as if you're converging, or that Nepal is converging to Pakistan. Think of where it is, a landlocked country, far away from anything, from the ability to trade to the world. So that sense is really important. And it's not just in terms of GDP and whatever. Human development is now beginning to lag behind even the rates of progress that African countries can have. For example, the progress in child mortality rates, percent of children that die before the age of 5, now Pakistan is well worse than places like Ghana or India, Bangladesh or Nepal. And actually in 1990, it was similar things. So the kind of amount that stayed behind is important. Now, how do you understand this? And it's important to understand this because actually, if we look at countries that made progress, you'd say, well, none of them look like Pakistan. No, actually, the countries that made progress don't look like each other either. There's a lot of places that don't look like each other and they all progressed. I haven't mentioned Singapore or Korea, forget about them. That's another time, that's another period. Think of countries that in recent times could progress and actually just asking yourself, why were they progressing and why Pakistan wasn't? And the diagnosis, it's quite important that if you start looking at sources of success and failure, it's not as simple that like all these countries had perfect institutions. They had good economic governance and no corruption. No. That's too easy. All these countries that made progress, Bangladesh has a lot of corruption. India has actually corruption. China, Indonesia, all these countries that made progress, they had it as well. So don't just reduce it. We just need to first get the institutions right and then we can start developing. No, these countries didn't wait for that to actually begin to progress. Similarly, it's across different political systems. You know, if you think, oh, we need to have an autocrat, otherwise it won't work. And I know sometimes people in this country like the idea of somewhat autocratic government. You know, there's plenty of these places. In fact, Ghana moved away from an autocratic system, a military regime, when it then started taking off. So it's not like democracy in itself is to fail or not. In fact, in the world, I have this very unfortunate thing as a Democrat, as someone who really likes democracy. On average, autocracies have performed similarly well in this period than democracies. The only thing with autocracies, by the way, is that the variance is much larger, i.e. some of the best ones were autocracies, but some of the worst ones as well. And the problem with autocracies, you usually can't pick them. And you don't know which one they will be, the best of the worst of them. And similarly in economic strategies, and that's quite important. You know, there was a review, it's already now about 15 years ago, the Growth Commission. And it probably best remembered through one very simple line, which was Bob Solow and later on Michael Spence, who coordinated some 2 Nobel Prize winners. But it was Robert Solow, the growth theorist, who was asked, you know, can you explain Bangladesh and can you think of how growth should come about? And he said, well, you know, actually, you know, I don't really know. I know the theory, but we don't quite know the exact recipe for growth. We know the ingredients. And what are these ingredients typically? Virtually all these successful countries, they had some reasonable macroeconomic policies. They corrected their economy sensibly and sustainably when they needed to. They were usually quite outward-oriented and not too inward-oriented. They were sensible about health and education and infrastructure and so on. Let's call this a broad family. That's like ingredients. The combinations of them, they're quite different in different places. So actually one of the great things about the last 30 years is that you don't have to simply follow a blueprint, including one printed in Washington, exactly to actually make progress. You actually have some choice. You have some agency. But you can also do lots of unreasonable policies and screw it up. Afraid you know where I probably would put some of the things, as already was alluded to, here as well. There is a broad set, and you have to ask yourself, well, why do they pick all these kind of unreasonable sequences of policies? So why is it that countries that stay behind, well, if we see them picking economic policy that seem to be unreasonable, and why is that? And why do some actually begin to pick some reasonable ones? Well, in the book, I talk about actually where you have to look at is actually the underlying elite bargain. And what we think about is that it's always helpful. You know, we like as economists models. And one model is look at the state as a solution to a problem of violence. This is Douglas North, Nobel Prize winner. Think of the state as a structure that tries to overcome a problem of violence. And how do they do that? By forming a dominant coalition amongst elite players who can sustain more or less stability in return for a deal about access to resources and access to activities, i.e. the control of the state and the economy and the blueprint for it. So think of every state as having a particular elite bargain. So in my book, I talk about it. And the elite is not just the people outside this. Can I actually say, I'm pretty sure that, I don't know who, but at least half of you are elite as well. You know, you're part of it. You know, it's not the journalists in the room, they are that. The business people in the room are that. The politicians, of course, are that. The military are there. The senior civil servants are there. You know, they're all part of the elite, one way or another. It's a broad group. And at any moment in time, there is a kind of a coalition that is in power, you know. Earlier we alluded to maybe the civil servants were pretty good in this thing and they got their reforms for their thing. That's what I'm thinking of. And it's always a bit of a coalition for just about stability. Pakistan is the just about one. But it always involves politics and economics. Okay, and that's important. It always involves politics and economics. It's not just about the political class does something and the rest does something. You know, the business community you have exists and looks like it is because of the nature of the politics. The military behavior looks like it because of the nature of the politics and vice versa. All these things are intertwined, and you have to think of it of that elite bargain. So you could have, for example, an elite bargain. The extreme ones, I mentioned Congo earlier, Democratic Republic of Congo. Well, actually, for many decades, that was just a pure kleptocracy. If you belong to the state, you had a license to steal. Very few countries are purely kleptocracies. Actually, quite a lot of them are patronage-based elite bargains, where it depends. It doesn't matter who, it's not so important what you do, but who you know and how you connect it. And actually, what we then often talk clientelism. People get rents because they are connected to the state, and they in return for their loyalty. People get contracts in return for loyalty, and it's this kind of mutual reinforcement of this whole thing. Maybe you recognize it. And I think, but how do you get the development in a place like this? Well, it's actually at some point, countries like the ones I have the flags of there, like China, like Indonesia, like Bangladesh and India, are somewhere or another within these kind of systems where patronage, clientelism, where, you know, bits like corruption and all these things seem to exist. There's enough common ground that actually the incentives are enough aligned that they're trying to get growth and development. That's what happened after 79 in China. That's happened in Indonesia in the 1970s, and then again after the Asian crisis in 97. That's what happened in Bangladesh in the 1980s and early 90s. That happened in India in the 90s. Let me say India for a moment. It's not just 1991 with economic reforms. Actually, it's interesting. The political class didn't necessarily accept it. The left was quite against the reforms. It was a minority government, but actually, I've been told in some of the crucial votes, rather than the left killing it, they walked out. And they allowed the votes to go through, knowing full well it was actually important, but they couldn't be seen to be supporting it. So you needed less votes. BJP was totally against it at the time. And then by the late 1990s, it was campaigning about the economy. Now you think of Modi always about campaigning about the economy. That's what I mean by the change of this commitment of the political class to growth and development. They all, broadly speaking, agree on these key tenets of economic policy and direction. That's what changed in India in the 90s, which wasn't there before. Why would you do that? Well, you know, if you have the slightly cynical view of states as always some form of elite bargain where people are in there to try to get elements of rents, why would you start being committed to growth and development? Well, rarely it's out of conviction. You know, even in Western countries like in Britain, it wasn't really in the 19th century that suddenly the people with lots of power and money thought, well, it would be a good idea to share it a bit broader out, you know. No. We actually, it's interesting, economic historians write about social development and democracy, and one title of a well-known paper is Democracy by Mistake. That actually the elites thought they could keep control by always opening up and make it a bit more inclusive. And then actually, oh, by the way, we've lost. And that's actually an important part. Change as growth and development is a risky business because new elites will emerge. Educated people will emerge. They will have voice. They will want to have other things in the economic class. They may undermine the status quo. The elite likes the status quo. And that's an important part. But sometimes there's enough pressure that they may want to seek legitimacy, which happened definitely in Indonesia and definitely in China. They may want to maximize rents, but there needs to be a route towards can actually still have power enough later on and get some of these rents. And that makes it so hard because the status quo, I know, even though it's basically a messed up economy, but actually growth is threatening. And I want to actually say that growth here is threatening. And that's actually why it is so hard to actually get to it, because it's threatening for the existing elite bargain. So what do I think is the elite bargain here? I'm going to provoke you, and I can be wrong, okay? I can be totally wrong, okay? But if I like to look at it, it's the elite with the power and influence and a dominant coalition without it, within it, and I've already alluded to, it's quite broad. So don't put it only on the political class. Put it also on all these other groups that I mentioned there as well. And there is a form of dominant coalition. What is that in Pakistan? You know, the construct, almost since independence, is fragile by design, entirely focused on just about enough stability. So you get your curve moving, but not deep enough because you do your little corrections, because it's all about the status quo. That's what is so threatening. So if we want to do all these reforms, we need to think about how can that status quo be disrupted. For those who start dreaming of Arab Spring, you know, 10 years ago, we all dreamt of it. Not a single country is better off from that kind of uprising, okay? Not a single country in the Middle East is better off now than compared to, in terms of the people, than compared to before. But somehow, we have to understand. And the history is clearly some families, let me put it like this, some landlords, some trader families, you know them better than I do, focused on a status quo with fundamentally a clientelist patronage state that gradually gets more expensive because you keep everybody happy, you need to give them more and more. So that's that elite bargain that you alluded to. It costs money and it gets increasingly expensive to keep that going. But actually everybody loves the competition around it because this is a winner-takes-all system. This is not a coalition of a dominant coalition. This is actually winner-takes-all. So even though I will fight whatever I can whenever someone is trying to do something, because I want to be there to be in charge of the clientelism and the patronage. So I will fight forever. And if you get a third party coming in, they will fight to get that same control, and then the others don't like it. Anyway, there's very little common purpose in that. And am I allowed to say something about the military? Yeah, I'm sure I am. But you know, political class in competition with the military also want to be seen to be the guarantors of stability, who control access, control the state, and so on. And so they also like that, but that's just part of that same elite bargain. That's not something that they're totally different. Okay, so the third part is what does it mean for the economics? And I need to hurry up, I'm sure. What does it mean? Okay, you know, I always smile when I hear of another technical assistance program to get tax revenue collection up in this country. You know, every IMF program has had a revenue increase tax collection program, you know? I mean, it's a very simple thing, you know, the low tax equilibrium is part of the political equilibrium. It's part of the clientelist state. It's part of the patronage system. You know, let's just admit to that. You know, it's clear that it will be, whatever it is, 8% of GDP. Whatever reform you do, it will be 8% of GDP because someone else will now need to gain while someone else needs, when someone needs to be paying more. So it's really have to be conscious of that actually all these reforms are part. This is a clientelist patronage system that is expensive. You know, high subsidies that are part of it. So you get very low savings rate, low investment rates, a consumption-based economy. It's all part of that equilibrium. Sometimes I think about it here as a bit like a Middle Eastern economy, but without the oil. You have to get the rents from somewhere else, from the rents and the debt from somewhere else, because otherwise it's always exactly the same as a North African economy. It's like more like Jordan than Algeria, if anyone knows the difference. And then basically the control regimes is actually trying to avoid new firms to emerge because they may challenge the status quo. So you've actually really control regime and the inward orientation are part of it. The licenses, access to procurement contracts, because everybody, even the opposition, is waiting for their time to be in power, to be back in control of the patronage. So they're part of that status quo, despite all the agitation. So you make it just about unstable enough so that the others get kicked out, but not unstable enough that the whole thing will collapse. And so, you know, poor business, in fact, that can go on. And basically, you know, it's this kind of strange precarious equilibrium that you get, where then once in a while you get an outsider to briefly stabilize it. IMF comes in, 24th program, oh no, 23rd already, 24th being in preparation, because we know the 23rd will not be completed. And it was always this thing, you know, it's a bit like hope over reason, because the first part will always be completed, but actually you can't see it through. And so, you know, can I actually make a contrast? Bangladesh went into the IMF recently, a year ago or something, and they went for a pre-crisis reform loan. Pre-crisis reform loan. My Bangladeshi friends said, why are they going to the IMF? And look at the program. They're just going to do what they wanted to do anyway. That's the point. That's how you do it. That actually you go. You don't go when it's too late and it will cost you a huge amount and it's all impossible, but you go in good time. Anyway, is this time worse? Well, this patronage clientelist state gets more expensive, and you're suggesting maybe it's actually worse than before. There's maybe a slightly shift in geopolitics that the bailouts are not so easy anymore. So what does it mean for economic policy making? Just understand how difficult it is to get growth and development central to the thinking of those who are in charge. That's not the driver. The driver is just enough stability so I can keep power. Just enough stability. Growth and development would disrupt this status quo. Low implementation is part of that equilibrium. Because, you know, you get an obsession now with quick technical fixes, so get it just enough stable enough, but there's no intention to see this through. and the international community, I think we've been complicit. You know, it used to be maybe only the G7 or the international or the Washington-based institutions or the IMF that actually is willing to, because one is very afraid of more instability. So it's part of that just enough stability, status quo thing. Although China and the Gulf states are now playing the same game. So can it be fixed? Look, I'm actually going to be a little bit more positive now, okay? Some lessons. Experience teaches that when such systems come to their bottom point, change is possible. If you look at the experience of India, of Bangladesh, of Indonesia, of China, they reformed when things were really bad. China, never forget that. We thought, I'm old enough to remember that there was discussion of will China survive the Cultural Revolution, Mao's death, the Gang of Four. Deng Xiaoping found a coalition inside the party, and there's never one person, there's never an autocrat on his own, a coalition to say, we need to regain legitimacy in this country, otherwise we lose all our power. And we're going to get it through food security and to growth. That's what Deng Xiaoping did. That's the kind of thing. So there are moments in time. But it does need the building of common ground. And not just on the economic part, but it needs people that begin somehow within also these other communities to get a common interest in this. So you can have a perfect economic plan, but you need to get that buy-in in it. And it mostly fails in the short run. And in fact, the reforms doesn't get continued, because if you don't have that common purpose, you will actually, as someone who doesn't control the power at that moment, well, it's extremely easy to destabilize a country. During reform periods, it's extremely easy to destabilize and not be part of it. You know, mobilizing the street, mobilizing people, it's extremely easy to do that. So the only way you do reform is actually building some form of common purpose. And so interesting to see what happened in Sri Lanka now. And I don't think it will continue like that, but it is definitely how it was now, versus, for example, Mauritius in the 1980s. Okay, so let me say first in Sri Lanka, and you will recognize it. A deep crisis, you know, clearly a derailed economic policy in the previous regime. You know, tax collection rates from above 20% to, what is it, 7% or something of GDP, you know, like massive collapse in revenue collection and the whole fiscal situation and the debt crisis and the whole thing. I was there about half a year ago, just when the IMF deal was come through. I had a chance to talk to politicians from the left and from the right who are not in government. They all acknowledged that once they were in power, they probably would also have to do an IMF deal, but it was totally in their interest to be totally against it and mobilize the street against it. I was from the right and from the left. That's essentially the problem. That's not the way to do the deal. So that basically there's a failure there of the political class there also to actually get that country back on track. Contrast with Mauritius. They went very early to the IMF in the late 1970s, one of the first ones to go. They knew, my God, all our socialist development policies, early things, they all failed. They went to the IMF. They went through a program. They had, during the time of the program in the early 1980s, virtually every major political party ended up in government at some point because the government kept on falling because of the IMF program. They kept systematically the same team of technical advisors because they all knew they had to see it through. They couldn't say it in the street, but they had common purpose enough. And by 1987, so Mauritius started growing at 7% per year, never looked back. These turnarounds are possible. It's not about a quick fix. The tinkering and finding some money and bits and pieces, it will make reform more costly. Getting the basics right will matter. So what is required? There is no shortcut to building common purpose, common ground across politics and even with the military. You know, have to be a basic recognition. The status quo is untenable. It is too expensive for the country, this status quo. It hurts Pakistan, and even the elite is losing now. That's why it actually is a good moment as well. So who would be involved? Don't put it just on the politicians. Don't just put it on the military. Don't put just on the technocrats. It goes well beyond it. Actually, those communities that could gain from opening up, there's bits in the business community, probably young people, youth, lots of people here in the room, they would gain from actually this picking up. It becomes their role in the elite to build this common purpose. You can't wait for the politician to stand up, or for the autocrat to stand up, or for the military to do something. You have to be part of it. But it doesn't mean that you have to agree on politics, by the way. I don't have this kind of imaginary thing. Think of Bangladeshi politics. These two families hate each other, okay, deeply, but they have common purpose around the economy. Indonesia politics, they really can't stand each other. Let's not get going on India either. They can't, there is contestation. That's not the same. It's actually, there's a basic common ground on something doing sensible for the economy. So what can be done now? Do the basic reforms, but understand that for sustainability, you have to think about the politics. So you have to ask yourself with the reforms you do, can it survive politics? How can we work on it? And we'll ask ourselves, are the things we're doing, will they help to showcase success? So that's the problem sometimes with IMF programs in the way we execute them. The easy things is scrapping things, and the harder things are building things. So we scrap something and everybody complains. We don't invest enough in saying, no, we have to actually get these building things to make it look as if it benefits in due course as well. Very hard one. So I have a little list there, lay foundations now for sensible macroeconomics, but really think about it. It can't be short-termism, you have to be longer. Tax collection, that actually begins to touch on the clientelism, dangerous politically, but do it in ways that's hard to object to. For example, there's places where people have done it through elements of automation, where I actually say, well, how to object to technology and so on. And I have other things there as well. Go after subsidies smartly, be thinking through it. How will it work through the politics? Can we then sustain it? Pockets of excellence are important, and on anything that can help you export. Because by the way, the only countries that have sustained their growth is actually by selling to the world. And you're not selling that much to the world these days. So conclusion, the turnarounds happen, big experts, Nobel Prize winners like Gunnar Myrdal and James Mead can get it totally wrong. It looks very bad here, but turnarounds happen. Gunnar Myrdal said in the late 1960s that Indonesia could never start growing. In the 1970s, he turned itself around. James Mead, Nobel Prize winner, said on Mauritius somewhere in the mid-1960s, oh, no way this will ever be a success story. We'll still be writing here about the failure of Mauritius for decades to come. Okay, this is can happen. But there's no shortcut. You have to link these things. There has to be a common purpose, and you need to think through it. And then finally, you need to do economic policies understanding the nature of the political equilibria. We can't just be technocrats. We're self-evident as economists. But actually, you have to think through, is there a path through it, and how do you begin to build this? More to say, but I'll leave it now for now. Okay, thank you very much.
There you go, ladies and gentlemen. You heard Stefan Dercon, as you know, by the flyer. He's one of the most influential economists with his book, Gambling on Development. And it's thanks to Naji and the World Bank, Tobias, that they brought us, Stefan, to us. So with that, I'd like to bring in Matthew Vergas, also a director in the World Bank. Director of which department, sorry? Equitable Growth Department. So he is the fitting person to comment on what, or at least carry the discussion forward. So
thank you very much, Nadeem. It's a pleasure to be here. It was an opportunity for me to meet Nadeem Ullah, something I've been looking forward to, and to meeting with you. I've also learned it's a bad idea to try and follow Stefan Dercon on a panel, so I won't do that again, but I'm very glad to be here. So I've been at the World Bank for a long time, and therefore working in development for a long time. And one of the conclusions I came to early was that if you want to work on development, you have to be an optimist. You have to believe that tomorrow can be better than today. Otherwise, you should pack up and do something else. So I'm going to take a somewhat optimistic view of Pakistan. Now, this is actually not as hard for me as it might be for others. I'm from India. I grew up in India. And when I was starting to study economics, even in high school, in India, we were looking to Pakistan and Sri Lanka as the success stories. and trying to understand why India was doing so poorly and why, what was Pakistan doing and what was Sri Lanka doing that were making them successful and holding us back. With, at that time, we were much more conscious of how similar our systems were, our histories, the cultures to a large extent. But I've carried that memory with me, which has kept in me this notion that Pakistan should be a success story. There is absolutely no reason, really, why Pakistan shouldn't be one of the great success stories of the world. This, by the way, was reinforced a little bit because on this trip, I arrived and went straight to Lahore and then to Sialkot and met some of the businesses there, which also sort of reinforced that notion that there are pockets of excellence that it should be possible to replicate. Having said that, it's not always easy to be an optimist. And that is certainly true, I think, in Pakistan today. But where I want to, that was a great talk by Stefan. So I'm not going to react to all of that, but I'm just going to continue one of his themes, which is one place that we have consistently seen these elite bargains move in a positive direction is after crises. Not always. There are many crises that are wasted, but we've seen enough of them to know. Stefan mentioned several. India was certainly part of my consciousness in 1991, but then in countries that I worked on myself, there was the East Asian crisis after the East Asian financial crisis. There was Turkey right after that. Several others. To Sri Lanka now, where I'll be in 2 weeks, where we're part of that. And what is not obvious, I think this is the great challenge, is how you convert the urgency of the crisis. I mean, in my previous trip here and in this trip, and when you read the newspapers, it's very hard to find somebody who doesn't agree that Pakistan needs to change. And that very much includes the elite, right? Now, whether they're willing to, how that converts into actual change is the big challenge. But, to take your story on India. So India in 1991 was arguably in a worse position than Pakistan today. So India in 1991 took their gold, their physical gold reserves out of the vaults of the Reserve Bank of India, put it onto military trucks, went to the airport, shipped it to the Bank of England, which was the only way that the Bank of England would give a loan with that collateral to keep India able to pay its bill for a few more weeks. That was the situation that India was in. Now, I've followed that case for many years, and now recently I had a chance to talk to some of the principals who were involved at that time. And it's not clear what brought that about. So one thing that was very helpful was that the technical people who cared about this were starting to prepare for this possibility a year or two ahead. And to me, that's how I view this. And efforts like this, the need to start preparing for the possibility that change is going to be possible. And for that, you have to be bold. At that time, this is the time that you're unconstrained and you can be bold and you put together the ideas that you think will make a difference. In India's case, Montek Singh Ahluwalia, who was a senior bureaucrat, had prepared this famous document called the M document that nobody ever saw, or it wasn't public certainly, but that became the basis of the reforms once he got the go-ahead to say, okay, you are part of the team that is now going to do the reforms. And one of the things that happened was Prime Minister Narasimha Rao went to the opposition and he said, look, we have no alternative. Our gold is gone. Our country may not survive. Here, we are going to do the things that we have to do to survive. And you may or may not agree with them, but what you should do is not stop them. And there was no agreement. They didn't say, yes, we will do that. Please go ahead. He went back and he told his team to go ahead. And what they did, as it turned out, was what Stefan said, which is they didn't go all out to stop it. They voiced their opposition to it, but they didn't actively try to stop it, which allowed those reforms to go through. Now, in Sri Lanka, when we talked to the parliamentarians in the run-up to the preparation of the bank and the IMF programs, it's certainly not the case that all the politicians on the opposition side have bought into the reforms. That's not the case, and I don't think that's ever going to be possible usually in these situations. But it is also certainly true that some of the key opposition leaders understand the importance of what needs to happen, and they are willing to say that they want these reforms to go ahead, but they're going to keep a close eye on government to make sure that they're not taking advantage of this. Now, with these things, how this will turn out, how Sri Lanka will turn out, is very much an open question. But I'm hopeful. I'm an optimist. I'm hopeful that we will see a turnaround in Sri Lanka like this. So the last point I wanted to make was we looked, especially in the run-up to our work in Sri Lanka, we looked at some of these cases like India, Turkey, East Asia, to ask ourselves, what were the elements of success? What are the elements of success? So this doesn't answer the question, how do you get the elite bargain to come through to allow it to go forward? But if you do get that, what are kind of the elements of success? And we put it down to 4 C's: credibility, communication, capability, and coordination. So in some ways, the credibility is the most important thing. And the things that give credibility are a sense that the reforms are really addressing the problem. So it's not window dressing. It's not sparing the parts of the economy that are politically powerful but contribute to the problem, but really addressing the heart of the problem. So that's the single most important step in credibility, that it seemed to be addressing the what caused you to be in this mess in the first place. Interestingly, one core part of this, one common theme to all of this, was that it wasn't about all of these places had IMF programs, but what was striking about these programs was that it wasn't just about the IMF program. So whether something was in the IMF program or not, see, the IMF program has a very critical mandate of bringing about stability, and that's the first step. It's necessary. But what all of these programs understood, what all of these leaders understood, was that it was not sufficient if you're going to reset the economy. And so they would put things into that program, start things in that program that are not part of the IMF program, because for them, it wasn't about the IMF program. It was about how to make sure that we don't get in this mess again, because this is not where we want to be. And then transparency. So they were very open about what needed to be done, and everyone could see and comment and protest, but there was no hidden agenda. On communication, so first is actually to communicate, and that's not as simple as it sounds, because often what these programs were doing in the short run were painful, were difficult reforms. And so there are very few politicians whose preference is to get up on the stage and announce these difficult things. But that was absolutely critical. Part of that was also being very clear that these are things that we are doing for ourselves, that these are not, we are not, you had the cartoon in there about satisfying the IMF. But in all of these cases, it was very clear that they were taking the responsibility and saying, we are telling you that this is what we need to do to make progress, and that's why we are doing it. This was very clear. And actually, in many of them, as soon as that program was completed, they didn't go back to the fund. India certainly didn't go back to, and still hasn't gone back to the fund, but they've kept the reforms going. So a big part of communication is ownership. On capabilities, so this is actually an important criteria to think about in a program like this. India today, when the World Bank, so actually it's not a theoretical exercise, we're just finishing up what's called a country economic memorandum, which is a reform note for India, which suggests all the reforms that the World Bank thinks India should do. And it's a long list, 20 years after the reform. So it's not the case that the initial 3 or 4 years, they're going to fix everything. And this point on capabilities is to recognize the importance of matching what you're trying to do with the actual capabilities. I'll give you a small example that's fresh on my mind in Sri Lanka. So Sri Lanka wanted to enact something like 30 new laws in a very short period of time. And consistent with what I said before, not all of them for the IMF. These were things also that they wanted to do because this was an opportunity to make changes that were long overdue. But certainly the Ministry of Justice didn't have the capability, and the individual ministries didn't have the capability. So they spent some time thinking about, well, how do you actually get this done? The nitty-gritty of getting it done. In their case, they put together an omnibus. So they were going to pass all the laws on one day in an omnibus line. They pulled a number of retired lawyers out of retirement to help draft the laws on the one hand, and another group to review the laws. So one group drafting on behalf of the ministries, another group reviewing on behalf of the Ministry of Justice. So understanding capabilities and paying attention to the actual capability to do the reforms was a common thread right through. And then the final point is coordination, which is linked in a way to capability, which is the importance of coordination. This can be between the various ministries. It can be many of the reforms require changing of responsibilities of various ministries. For example, a very common one in many of these countries is SOEs, state-owned enterprises, have been historically loss-making and both contributing to the fiscal deficit, but also stifling private enterprise. And one of the things that often needs to be done is that these SOEs need to be taken from the individual ministries that have been running them, and then either bringing them under a common holding company or the Ministry of Finance or some common unit, or starting the process of privatizing them or improving their management. But the point is that it requires, even within government, some winners and losers and some coordination, and that has to happen. It sometimes requires coordination between donors. In Sri Lanka, with the prospect, the thing about the donors is if there's any hope of a real reform, well, we want to be there. The donors want to be there. It's the time when you can make the most difference. And even more important in those cases, that these donors are well coordinated so that they are, not doing the same thing, that they make sure we're covering everything. So that was the 4 C's: credibility, communication, capability, and coordination. As I said, I'm hopeful that we'll see all of this in Pakistan, but I suspect the next few months will tell us a lot. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, I think since we started late, we've got a short amount of time. Let me begin with one question. Folks, you prepare your questions and we'll take them very quickly. Just one question, Stefan. You talk about elite bargain, and fair enough, and the overview that you've given us is wonderful. But I think this also begs the question, what you say, you talked about that a little. We've got a lot of development books. That is Asimov Robinson, 2 of them. We've got North. We've got so many others. Phelps. So many people have written about development. How does your thinking differ from them? And how does it compare with them? Because the question is that we have a lot of this stuff and we don't know how to handle it. We have
Yes.
a little bit of difficulty in understanding.
Thank you for that question. I would say read my first chapter in the book, actually, which where I try to do it. But I think one of the things as a lot of these development books do is correctly, talk about what should be done. The trying to communicate the basic tenets of what should be done. And we were alluding to earlier, I was alluding to the Growth Commission report. It's actually also a very good report in saying these are the kind of things that successful countries do. And I would look at a lot of these books over the years written, you put it in a different space. If you read the Joe Stiglitz books, it's all in the international system. If you get the maybe more the Jeff Sachs or the Paul Collier's, it's all in domestic particular reforms that need to be done. And it makes a lot of sense. What I wanted to make sure is to actually understand things like, but why doesn't it happen? Now you could say Acimoglu Robinson, massive bestseller. It was a great thing for them that they brought it out during the Arab Spring. They had lots of speaking engagement all over the Middle East to say how they just had to change their institutions. The problem with the institutional agenda is it creates the impression, A, there is a blueprint for institutions. Basically, if you read their book, it's as long as you look a bit like Britain and their offshoots like America, then you'll be successful. And all the other examples are it's total failure. It doesn't help you understand how you actually may begin to make this progress, even if there's this kind of imperfection in relative to that blueprint. So what I wanted to do is to actually put the agency back there. It's not about institutions, which according to the literature are shaped through historical foundations. In fact, that's what the core research papers tell us, that settler patterns originally are causing the institutions you have. I was working for a long time as a DFID chief economist. If I go to Nigeria and I go and talk to President Buhari, and he asked me, how can we develop better? My best answer based on Acimoglu Robinson was, why don't you get yourself a better history? Now, if you come as a British official, it's not very useful as a piece of advice. And I'm not inventing it. Political scientists have often talked about the agency and the actors today. And I wanted to put the agency back. You know what Matthew is talking about? There was agency, Manmohan Singh and others. They began to act. They were coalescing the forces. They were going to talk to the things. That's what you want to explain. Why 91 and why not 1981? Why 1979 in China and not 1966? That's actually what you try to say. And okay, there's agency. And agency involves the kind of thing that we understand, the interaction between people, the deal making between different interests and so on. I think I wanted to put that to the fore because for me, I'm more optimistic. Sorry, it's more hopeful because it means change is possible and you're not stuck somewhere because of history. Change is possible. And, do I really know how to then get to this kind of bargains, deals that are being made? No, I'm not usually in enough of these shadowy rooms with cigarette smoke and whatever, where all the conversations are happening. But I do recognize that you have these moments in history where something seems to be changing. Think of it, it's a slightly different equilibrium that emerges. By the way, why during conflict that Matthew correctly alluded to, these things are possible, because conflict makes the existing equilibria unstable. And so you can actually, you don't need to push as hard to try to go to another one. Of course, the problem is you can also push it a little bit to a totally worse equilibrium as well. And that's why often crises can be forgotten.
Yeah. Matthew, quickly, let me go to you too. Definitely rightly pointed out, there's no blueprint. And he also points out that we need to form our own bargains. But if I look at the history of development, there has been blueprints. Can't say there is no blueprint. We've been told by SDGs, for example, that, hey, you're going to do this. We've been told by many interventions that you're going to do this. Best practice is a very important term that's put to us, that we must follow best practice. So Stefan and Matthew, how would you react to that? Then you tell us capabilities. But this is a problem that we don't pay attention to, which is a big debate in the country right now. The concept of human capital flight. brain drain. I mean, whoever we train, if we train anybody even a little bit, instantly he goes out or goes to the World Bank office. So how do we build that capability? Or another thing, for example, I meet tons of secretaries, current secretaries, additional secretaries, who are all looking. In fact, yesterday I met one who says, oh, I'm now looking for an active job at the ADB because I have another few years to go senior. So he's looking for an active job. Same thing, our last finance secretary left his job to go work for a donor. So how about that incentive system? And is there a blueprint? You talk about the technocrats. Do they have the right incentive system? Or do they not? So, I mean, I think there are deeper questions that we also need to get into. But very quickly, I'll turn to the floor.
So, on the question of blueprints and best practices, I'm very much in the camp, which says that reforms have to be homegrown. Even if you believe that the blueprints and good best practices are right, the fact is that every country has its own context where some things, where things are different. And so the critical thing is to understand your own system and see make an attempt at what's going to work. The big lesson that I've taken from all these years is really, it's not so much where you start, but how you continue the journey and which will determine where you finish up. Albert Hirschman had a book called, I think it was called Development Projects Observed, or something like that, that looked at various World Bank projects and why they weren't doing so well. But one of the points he made was that development is such an uncertain business that you start with a plan, but the most important thing is how you adapt to the changes so that you actually make progress. And I'm a firm believer in that. In terms of capabilities, this is a big problem, but I have to say, I suspect in Pakistan you have the capabilities. If the other part, I would be less worried about that. I mean, I do think you do need to manage it so that you're not trying to take on too much. But I think if the elite bargain comes through, my sense is that you have capabilities here that are, and we saw this, in the time of the flood response in Sindh. I mean, to me, that was a very impressive display of what state governments are capable of doing with the central government in a crisis when they decided to move. So let me stop there.
Okay, folks, let me just say that time is running out. We'll probably have a chance for 2 quick questions, and I'll ask you to do those questions together so that both the participants can answer. Quickly, Shahid. Very quick question because we don't have the time. I know there's a lot to debate, but for God's sakes.
Thank you, Dr. Nadeem. Thank you for both of you gentlemen. I hope I just have a minute or two at least.
No. Quick. Half a minute.
Like seconds? Come on.
Half a minute.
Okay. Anyway, Stephen, thank you. First of all, you said that you wanted to provoke us. I'm guessing you wanted to say that you want to intellectually provoke us because you just don't want to provoke us. Nothing good comes out of that. All right. By provoking us. Okay. So I have a question to you, and then I have a quick question to Matthew too. So you said most of what you said, it comes down to homegrown reforms, right? But there is an important part missing. I thought there was missing. You alluded to that. But what about elites that are supported by external actors, right? And the external actors, they are comfortable with that because they get the best bargain. Now, I'll give you 2 examples. You know about the Russo-Ukraine, everybody knows about that. And I'm sure you also know about that a lot of weapons from Pakistan are going to the front line, right? That would not have been possible if there were no elites in Pakistan and not supported by external actors. They talk directly to them. Then there is another example. We just signed another agreement for a nuclear power plant, which will saddle us with around $3 billion of more debt. And there was no discussion. There was just government-to-government agreement. So there are external actors. That's another important aspect. I wonder what you would like to say about that. Now, Matthew, just a quick question. It's since you are talk about equitable resources. So just a quick question about redistribution of resources. You gave example of China, you gave example of India, and there are good examples. But here's a fact. Income distribution, if you look at it, a very small percentage controls a very big part of wealth in all those countries. It's a huge problem. And historically, we've seen that these have given rise to revolutions, too, very bloody ones.
Quickly.
French Revolution, Russian Revolution, and in China. So is there a tipping point somewhere where
Okay.
these turn?
Quickly, last question. Come on.
Thank you.
Quick.
Thank you very much, Professor. First of all, a clarification. Not many people are this elite because elites don't have to borrow money to pay their electricity bills. So, okay. To me, what I have understand from your presentation that you say that it is the elite bargain that will drive development. And for that, but it does not happen growth enhancing because the policies are not as such, because elite prefer the status quo. But at the same times, it can also be said that the elite do not are not able to have that kind of mindset because policies as such. So it is a very endogenous kind of an argument. So we need, what do you think is the exogenous factor that could, clarify the things?
Great.
And that takes us back to, there was a book by Sung Hee Jua, that national ethos. Okay, we need to instill national ethos that is growth and development minded, and then which takes us back to old institutionalism, which has been largely forgotten, that it is the habit and all those things that change.
Okay,
thank you.
there.
So start with the last question here. So the where does the exogenous force comes from? And you talk about like national ethos and so on. I mean, my sense of it is that it can have very, very different manifestations of it. But it is true that in virtually every country, ideas or stories or narratives will matter. And it actually is part of, the way this kind of elite bargains reflect itself, so there's the storytelling around it. And that actually comes back to the kind of the leaders that actually keep everything on track. And so clearly in East Asia, this storytelling was important. But the storytelling alone, the kind of ethos, the national story alone is not enough. It has to be an ethos, as you kind of describe. But these things get shaped. And to bring it back to something that Matthew said earlier, why would at some point this emerge, and how can you credibly start telling these stories? I always find it very interesting. For example, Lee Kuan Yew in Singapore, they all like to think of it, this imaginary leader that knew it all and did it, because he had to establish credibility as well. And one of the first things he had to do is find a way of signaling, I actually mean what I say. And one of the things he did is one of the main business people that financed him, they put him in jail for corruption. That was a good signal that you actually wanted to be serious about it, that you actually try to do it. So the factors that how you can signal it can be doing it. Now, it relates to this other point of, why would they do it at some point? Well, it usually is exogenous factors of pressure. Legitimacy goes away. China, the party was at risk of disappearing. It lost all legitimacy. So you need to act doing it. And maybe it's slightly a cynical view, is that most elites like to stay in power and they want to find a way of doing it. So the exogenous factor, if I get it enough there, can also come from the pressures that are happening and channeled. And then there is the question on the external forces. The external forces, it's really, of course, it's there. What I want to write about in the book is actually something comparative, because these external forces are operating in all these different countries. And I would actually say it's too easy to say that holds Pakistan back relative to other countries. because these external games are happening everywhere. I study Africa, East Asia, and so on. They're happening everywhere. Indonesia is part of these games. Malaysia, Thailand, they're all part of these same games that you described, with the same players involved in it. It's how you play with them. And it's the way your elite local, it always needs a local elite to be willing to play in a particular way with these global players. And some play it better than others, and some play it more for the status quo. And this is clearly what you're referring to, because for those that you in both sides that are linked to the financing of these things, they actually like a stable Pakistan, but not a very strong Pakistan in terms of economic and growth and development. So that's clearly where the interest then comes into it. And so I think that they play a role, but it's not enough. You have to be willing to look inside. You can't blame the outsider only, because lots of players have come above it. And I can't help it to very quickly say, and you're going to stop me, on this earlier point on also on best practice and so on. It's the localization of things. Your common purpose has to be common, it has to be local, it can't be imported. So the underlying shared commitment is essential. And then, of course, you need to learn from examples from outside. But I actually just finished a paper on the political economy of economic policy advice, which I'm not finishing, I'm just trying to finish it. And the basic point is that and I'm actually attacking best practice and first best from the IMF, because I say, look, it needs to meet the local context, as you just said, and it creates constraints. So the more important point, and I think Matthew alludes to it, is that, and it's probably quick, two things here, is that the first thing is the experience of countries says that you actually tend to have the capability, once the underlying commitment in the senior positions is there. You may not be perfect, but perfection is never necessary. What is necessary is willing to correct and learn. And that's actually links to accountability. And it's accountability in the system, in internal accountability. But we've seen in countries, Matthew and I used to work in Ethiopia for a period, it grew very fast. The same supposedly low capability civil service started delivering quite a lot. The Indian civil service hadn't changed, and suddenly it was delivering an awful lot. That's actually important. The capability is there, but it has to be setting, and the incentives come from above. The incentives come from the way they're set. So learning and form of accountability is then part of it. Anyway.
On the question on the tipping point, I can be very brief. I don't know. There is in these circumstances, there is a risk that the tipping point will be the one that we don't want to see, people on the streets, violence. But what sends it in that direction, I don't know. But it is a risk.
Well, I know these guys have to go forward, so I'll stop right there. I think it's been wonderful, Stefan, to have you here. I've read your book, I've enjoyed it. And Matthew, great seeing you here too. It's absolutely wonderful. I'll just say this, that Europe had the advantage of innovating their elite bargains, their consensus, because elite bargain is common everywhere, I guess. Even the US has an elite bargain that they'll, screw the rest of the world. That's an elite bargain too. And Europe had the advantage that they did it themselves. We have the disadvantage of an open economy. I often thought I should write Animal Farm with an open economy. That if Animal Farm had a lot of advisors coming in from outside, how would they fare? I think what Stefan tells us, that we should learn to navigate those advisors. I agree, Stefan. But here in Islamabad, we have 100 agencies that one minister has to deal with, 100 different agencies. So I don't know whether the coordination problem is with us or with the donors. But these are deep issues that we'll take up some other time. Thank you very much. Thanks for coming. Thank you, Naji, for bringing us. Thanks to the World Bank. And I should move on.